Talking about organizational structure, we need to start by thinking about organizational effectiveness. We all think that we know what effective organizations are like. That is, they meet their profit margins, they are successful in terms of staying in existence for lengthy periods of time. They pay return on investment to shareholders, things like that. But it's really very complicated in terms of thinking about what success might mean. Of course, it gets even more complicated if we talk about organizations that are not for profit. So to make a generic definition of effectiveness, we might use something like success in meeting the stated goals and objectives of the organization. For our for-profit corporations, this would look like profitability, growth, market share, stability, and so on. Keep in mind, of course, that these are not always going to fit together beautifully, because in many cases, when organizations are trying to grow, they may in fact sacrifice some profitability to do that. More importantly, our different constituency groups are going to talk about effectiveness in different ways. And organizations all have many constituency groups. The bigger the organization, the more constituency groups. Constituency groups are people who want something from the organization, are interdependent with the organization in some way. And although you may have learned somewhere along the line that the stockholders are the only ones that we care about, this is not the case. And we also see these people, these groups of people being considered to be stakeholders in the corporation. Stockholders provide capital, but in today's environment, there may be very many other important resources, such as knowledge that we get from the people we employ, that are going to be very important in addition to capital. So here's a few examples. We could certainly come up with some more. Most corporations deal with stockholders, regulators, customers, suppliers, employees, and other things. So we need to decide what's going to be effective based on our stakeholders, and then we need to think about a structure that's going to get us there. So some points about organization structure. Structure is a deliberate choice. We've made this on purpose, and the goal of the structure is to increase effectiveness. So needless to say, the first thing we have to do is define what effectiveness is. There isn't going to be any one ideal structure. That's going to depend in great part on what the organization is like, what the task of the organization is, and what the environment of the organization is. Every structure has trade-offs. So something I pick is going to influence organizational outcomes. It's also going to influence some things negatively, right? So most trade-offs are going to involve efficiency and flexibility. That is, if I keep resources available so that I can change, then I'm not going to be as efficient. Or if I become very efficient, I'm going to have a lot of trouble changing quickly when the environment changes. So structures require both differentiation and integration. This is an important understanding that we have to reach as we think about the different structures that we can create. Typically, firstly, we need to divide up the work into manageable pieces. That's the differentiation part. We're going to group pieces of work in different places. And then we're going to have to reintegrate it so that it creates integrated products or integrated outcomes. We should always be able to determine the differentiation that's occurring within our structure and how it's integrated back together. What formulates the integration of the structure back together? So some basic structures, functional and divisional. These are obviously something that's pretty simple. We can group people into departments based on skills and work activities. So for example, the Darla Moore School of Business is based on 7 different departments, most of which are very functional in nature. There's an accounting group, there's a marketing group, there's a management group, there's a management science group, there's a finance group, and so on and so forth. That's a functional way of structuring. Or we can think about divisional groupings, so that we would be based on products or programs or geographic regions. That would be the case if we were more based, the Darla Moore School was more based on things like, well, here's the group of people that produce and service the professional MBA program. Here's the group of people that service and produce the Master's in Accountancy program. Needless to say, we're not really organized that way, but you can imagine how for some organizations it might make a lot of sense to be grouped in terms of the products that they produce or the geographic region that they're servicing. So here's a nice picture of a functional organization. It's not the best picture, but in any event, it's a taller structure. You can see that there are multiple layers between the CEO as we go down to the worker bees at the bottom of the organization. And for the most part, if you look at the lines that I've drawn in there, they go up and down. So what happens in this kind of structure is that communication has to occur in a vertical way. Typically, it's going to occur in a vertical way. This is going to be a problem as we go forward with more complex environments, as you might easily guess. Here are some likely effects of functional structures. It's efficient because I have economies of scale by grouping people who do the same function together. It has very strong top management direction and control. Again, all those vertical communication links mean that the top of the organization has the strong hand. It's easier to coordinate within the function because everybody talks the same language and they're grouped together. It's much harder to coordinate across functions because there's no real structural links that suggest that that's going to happen. It's less flexible. That is, since you keep on kicking the organization decisions up the ladder, you're not going to be able to make decisions very quickly or resolve conflicts very quickly. It's not easy to pinpoint responsibility for some outcomes because everybody's just working within their function. They're not working necessarily on a project or helping a particular customer. And organization employees may not have a great view of what the organization's goals are because they're in a function, and the function is what they do. If we look at the divisional structure, we see something slightly different. Here's a much flatter structure, as you can see. In this case, we should not see all those layers of management there, and we should expect that there should be a lot of peer-to-peer relationships going on. So what's the effect of a divisional structure? Typically, it's more flexible. It can move more quickly. Much more focused on the customer because that's how it's designed. It's easier to coordinate across divisions where people speak the same language from the accounting department in the washing machine division and the accounting department in the computer division. Much more difficult within them because people don't share all of that same knowledge and language. There are some duplication of resources if we have all of the functions represented in all of the different programs or departments and divisions. Less top management control because top management isn't making all the decisions, and there may be competition between divisions for those corporate resources. So computers think they're more important than washing machines, so they fight for somebody up above to make a decision to give them more resources, thus limiting some degree of the cooperation that might occur between those units. Typically, we would argue, since there is no one best way to organize, we would have to say that we're looking for a fit approach many times in a stable environment. We don't need a lot of flexibility. Efficiency is really important because everybody else is doing the same thing. So we do a centralized organization. We have a very formalized structure. It's quite mechanistic, but everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to do, and typically the needs for ad hoc communication are not high. This can also refer to parts of the organization. For example, I want to insulate manufacturing to some extent from demands immediately from the external environment so that I can be efficient with my manufacturing. In a dynamic environment, I know that flexibility is important. I know that efficiency may in fact be unattainable because I don't know exactly what's happening in my environment. So using a more decentralized mutual adjustment-based approach, that's more of a face-to-face or a communication-based way of integrating the organization. It's more organic. Maybe the way to go, maybe the best that I can do. Let's talk just a little bit about what IT does, information technology does for organization design, because this really has changed the whole outlook on what kinds of organizations I can create. If you think about differentiation and integration, a big part of this is once I've broken the organization into different chunks so that people can do their tasks, that issue of integration becomes particularly difficult. And information technology is perfect for integrating the organization back together, particularly if we're talking about something like a virtual organization where there aren't strong ties between the different parts of the organization. As information technology was introduced into organizations, very simple start to this, right? So if you have a very simple, repetitive operation that people are doing, then the first thing we're going to do is computerize it. So check writing for payroll, we can replace that easily. And in fact, of course, the computer is going to do it better because it isn't going to make mistakes based on lack of attention. Unfortunately, of course, these applications tended to be unique and independent, so they weren't really integrating the organization. What they were doing is making certain functions in the organization much more efficient. The second wave started to replace process controls, replaced informal communication and some decision making. So as people started to use decision support systems that help us make decisions like who's going to get a loan or who's going to get an insurance policy and what that insurance policy is going to look like, who's going to get into graduate school, we could in fact reduce the need for both management and staff. Still a lot of unique applications that could not talk to one another and use. As we get to the third wave, of course, we start seeing that there are some technological advances and some business events that make it much more likely that we can integrate across our organization. So if Microsoft and Intel homogenize computing systems, we may love it or hate it, but it is the way that eventually the whole system became integrated or is capable of being integrated. And mediating technologies develop from this. So specialization of customer groups and services, this is like dating services or developing complex financial products. Typically, nobody could use these or create these complex financial products without information technology, and they wouldn't know who to find as customers for them. Unfortunately for us, many times these are products that nobody can explain and nobody knows what they bought. This is one of the reasons for the financial collapse back in 2008. These are all key to complex organization designs because IT is the way that we can integrate the different parts of the organization and bring customers on board. So some newer ways of thinking about structure that are greatly facilitated by information technology. Matrix simultaneous functional and divisional chain of command. We can see, let's go ahead and look at this for just a minute. Here we have a bunch of different products across the top and a bunch of different operations down the side. That is functional areas. And these people in the blue boxes here are going to, in fact, have to report to two different people. This was first brought up in the 1970s, and what happened typically is it was abandoned pretty quickly because even the large resource-rich companies were trying it, they weren't able to make it work because the emphasis on sharing information in those boxes where people report to two different parts of the organization were just too hard to deal with without computerization. So what we see is a big resurgence here, right? Since it no longer depends on having a wonderful manager in that spot, it depends more on having great information technology. Now we can use it once again, and we can use it much better. So how's that going to help our organization? It's more efficient than a single hierarchy, a single divisional hierarchy. It's very flexible. We can move people around somewhat more easily. The dual chain of command, of course, is frustrating, but it also helps pull together different parts of the organization, right? This creates some enlarged tasks for employees. Also creates conflict on different sides of the organization. So the products may be in some degree of conflict with the functions. And the success still depends on the ability to coordinate both sides of the matrix. It's just that we have a lot more tools at our disposal and ready information at our disposal to help us do that. Okay, virtual organizations also. This is the last sort of outpost that we have in terms of organization designs based on IT. Virtual organizations are essentially temporary alliances of organizations that have more permanence. What the organization does is it contracts out almost all the functions to increase flexibility, decrease its costs. That means it doesn't have to hold on to resources that it's not currently using. There's some problems with this, of course, just as we might expect any type of organization structure. yeah, these businesses are supposedly focusing on their core competencies. They're tied together through temporary contracts and the information systems. Here's why it doesn't always maximize both efficiency and flexibility. One is there are transaction costs. This is essentially a situation where we are renegotiating our contract in the marketplace constantly, and that costs us something as opposed to using a hierarchy, which is more stable. Lots of opportunity for opportunism. That is, we don't know if we can trust all of our partners, and there are some pretty clear windows where they may take something they learned from us that was proprietary, or they may raise their prices because they know we don't have a lot of other opportunities to get that particular function at at the level that they can produce it. We also might think about people as not really preferring to have things change all the time. It's hard for us to think about that many things all the time. It's easier to continue to contract out with the same person as opposed to renegotiating that contract each time. And lastly, of course, if we're working with all of these different businesses that do what they do best, you're really limiting your own development of strategic resources that you can hold and not share with other people and then create a sustainable competitive advantage. It's very hard to do that in this context. So this is one reason why we might think that although virtual organizations have their place in having organizations become more efficient and flexible, this is not the only answer. We still need to be looking for more answers about how we can use technology to create sustainable competitive advantage.